An addict is anyone who has a self-destructive, compulsory behavior driven by the pleasure-pain principle of the subconscious mind. This includes drugs, alcohol, shopping, gambling, sex, and any other behavior that someone can participate in. It is different than other compulsory behaviors like OCD, because OCD is driven by a rogue mind whose only goal is to avoid the discomfort of not performing the behavior. OCD thinks on its own, quite distinct from logic, reason, or reality, and it appears out of nowhere, whereas an addiction is driven by the need to experience a pleasure previously identified and registered. We all have some consensus of who or what an addict is, yet addiction is so pervasive and common in our culture that very little time is actually spent on truly classifying or defining it. There are varying degrees and stages of addiction as it progresses. True addiction is defined by qualifications and traits that, contrary to popular belief, do not automatically include everyone who abuses drugs. There are non-addicts who are immune to addiction, while others are born with an addictive trait that is inherent in them, predisposition. This section provides a measuring and evaluation tool by defining and detailing the spectrum of the addiction experience. No matter which addiction category you find yourself or a loved one in, there is no way to definitively determine someone's status overall. The moderate or recreational user could be an addictive personality in dormancy. Knowledge is power, and therefore the usefulness of this knowledge will make itself evident to each person. This section is not about an addiction's genesis or cause. It is about the varying expressions and manifestations of it. There are 7 expressions and manifestations of drug abuse. 0, non-addict. 1, recreational. 2, moderate. 3, habitual. 4, dependent. 5, compulsory. 6, addictive disorder, AD. And 7, addictive personality disorder, APD. Each one is different and driven by progressively more intense reasons. Each progressive stage contains the seeds of the stages before it, as well as its own particular qualities. Like the volume knob on a stereo, the highly intense sound level of 10 contains all the amplitudes of levels 1 through 9 and adds another level of decibels to them, arriving at 10. 10 does not exist independently without first progressing through the prior stages. 0, the non-addict. There are people who are not tempted by or curious about drugs in the same way I am not even remotely interested in experiencing cannibalism or necrophilia. I can acknowledge that these things exist, and it is a curious phenomenon, but my curiosity ends there. Non-addicts are barely even curious about drugs in a personal use way. They intrinsically know it is unhealthy the same way I know that eating feces is not good or healthy. It is not created by upbringing, but good upbringing certainly supports and sustains a non-addictive mentality. The non-addict personality experiences a subtle repulsion at the thought of personally using drugs the same way the addictive personality is subconsciously, inexplicably attracted and drawn to it. In spite of exposure to contradictory perceptions and influences, both remain in their respective mentalities. I've known non-addicts who associated with drug users and the drug culture and were exposed to it regularly, and yet never succumbed to the curiosity of drugs. They were not militantly against them either. They were indifferent. Many non-addicts can and do experiment or sample drugs in their lives. Not every non-addict is completely repelled by them. When they do sample or experiment with drugs, they may even enjoy them, but they are ultimately either indifferent about them or find them unpleasant. It is either neutral or negative. Rare and particular circumstances can change a non-addict into a drug-dependent person. If a non-addict were kidnapped and forced to take addicting drugs, a physical dependency could be created, since no one is immune to physical dependence. However, once the source of addiction was removed, the non-addict would not feel compelled to return to it, even if he or she enjoyed the drug feeling to some extent. The non-addict would likely feel traumatized by being forced to take drugs and be controlled rather than develop an affinity with the potentially pleasurable features of them. Non-addicts can be persuaded to experiment with drugs through peer or family pressure, and they may experiment with drugs in an attempt to gain acceptance or validation and repeat using drugs for this objective without ever developing an affinity, appreciation, or even like of drugs. To the contrary, in order to gain acceptance, they may be discreet or even secretive about their true feelings of repulsion to drugs. Recreational. Someone who uses drugs in non-lethal amounts is consciously aware of his or her experimentation, uses in moderation, does not get wasted or used to the point of excess, is a recreational user. Excessive using causes out-of-character behaviors or episodes, and the recreational user is repelled by these unfavorable behaviors. They typically use in their youth, at parties or with friends, but they never get seriously involved. They say no to using opportunities when they have work to do or other obligations, which means using is a low priority. They consider using as an indulgence and not a need. They might even enjoy and even look forward to drug use, but there is no fixation, rumination, or serious planning involved to using them. It is rather opportunistic in the sense that they will party when drugs are available, but do not go out of their way to seek drugs out. These users do not participate in addictive hard drugs at all. They have clear instinctual boundaries. Like the non-addict, if they sample or experience a hard narcotic, they find it more uncomfortable than pleasurable. It needs to be pointed out that there is no way to use narcotics recreationally or moderately. Alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, and some behavioral addictions like gambling can, in some instances, be used in moderation. But hard narcotics, taken without a medical need, is simply abuse of the drug. Regular or frequent use or abuse of any narcotic qualifies someone for enough of the diagnostic criteria here to be considered an addict, since narcotics are addictive and dangerous. In other words, there is no safe or responsible way or appropriate time to use narcotics recreationally. Therefore, any time narcotics are used outside of an actual medical necessity, it is drug abuse and cannot be categorized as recreational, ever. Non-addictive people don't abuse or misuse their prescriptions or use narcotics recreationally beyond very isolated incidents. Add up all the recreational behaviors and add in a desire or preoccupation for the drug when not actually using it. The moderate user has the ability to be reasonable regarding drug use and to sustain control of frequency and quantity of use. Moderate users will refuse using when work or other obligations arise. However, there are some differences when compared to the recreational user. They will put more effort into planning to get loaded, anticipated, and even more frequent thoughts of looking forward to it. They will occasionally use in excess, getting loaded or wasted. But once they achieve excess impairment, they will stop and call it a night or day. Most moderate users will take some time off from getting loaded after an episode of partying, usually a few days or more. Moderate users are more excessive than recreational users, but they do have limits and boundaries. Some moderate users will experiment with narcotics, but never habitually. It will only be on occasion, and there will be some regret and awareness that they crossed a personal boundary. Add recreational and moderate together and intensify that preoccupation to something more conditional. A conditioned behavior is one that is repeated enough times with a positive association that it becomes a habit. The subconscious begins to make the person think of it often without provocation or cues. They find themselves doing it because it's what they do. It isn't questioned. It is an expected and accepted way of life. They are ignorant or in denial to the seriousness of their habits, as it is commonly believed that habits are relatively harmless. They typically think they are either recreational or moderate users, not habitual. So the individual in question is probably the least qualified person to categorize themselves. In the beginning, everyone thinks they are moderate or recreational. That's denial, baby. Denial is how the habitual, dependent, and addictive mentally downgrade and minimize their using. A habit is something that comes into our mind on its own. We don't deliberately or consciously think of it. Instead, it seems to manifest into our thoughts spontaneously. It is a behavior that is lodged and regulated not by the conscious mind, but by the subconscious mind. The desire for the experience is so indelible now that it needs little to no provocation or cue to start it. It is running in the background of the mind on a low frequency all the time, with pulses of increased amplitude, not an overwhelming amplitude, but loud enough to be felt and known. With conscious effort and commitment, these pulses of desires are manageable and not overly stressing. Without conscious control, they will run rampant and have specific potential to become compulsory. The subconscious has a mind of its own. This is not synonymous with addict. A non-addict who has developed a physical dependency on a drug is merely physically dependent, not addicted. One is physical and the other is psychological. If a person is physically dependent but not addicted, the craving to use more is only to alleviate physical suffering, not to fulfill an emotional or psychological desire. A starving person can force himself to eat something disgusting to alleviate hunger, but it doesn't mean he or she likes it. Similarly, a drug-dependent only person will use simply to alleviate the physiological need, but it doesn't mean he or she likes it. Cessation of drug use will cause physical withdrawals proportionate to the amount of substance used. Drug dependency is when certain organs, body chemicals, or abilities become reliant on that drug in order to function, and without those organs functioning, we suffer. It is necessary to distinguish between drug dependency and drug addiction. Often they are present together, but dependency can exist independently. A non-addict can experience dependency and an addict can escape it. I'm an addict, there's no doubt of that, yet I rarely use to the point of dependency, and I use a lot. I was capable, barely, of spreading out my using just enough to avoid withdrawal and acute dependency. I've had varying degrees of dependency, but it's technically possible for an addict to avoid it. A female client in her early 30s was in the early stages of a law enforcement career. An accident caused her to rely on painkiller opiate prescriptions to function at work, to manage her family and home due to the excessive debilitating pain. She stopped taking the pain meds as her physical injuries healed, but experienced intense degrees of drug withdrawal, which forced her to continue to take the prescriptions to function in life at all. There was zero mental commitment or emotional impulse to continue using them, as her drug use mentality was overshadowed by her moral perception that she was becoming a common drug addict. Her moral code fueled her to gain abstinence from the meds even more. Once she was beyond the physical dependency features, there was never an impulse to even consider using them again. I had a similar experience while I was hospitalized. While I was in a coma, I was administered copious amounts of fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, and hydromorphone dilaudid, which created very severe chemical opiate dependency. Being in a coma, I did not experience the pleasure qualities of the drugs. When I regained consciousness, I requested titration from the drugs. The withdrawal was intense and made me physically want more, but I was consciously and principally driven to refuse them and abstain, in spite of the withdrawal. Yes, I'm an addict, and yet, because opiates are not my DOC and because the trauma that hospitalized me eclipsed my addiction disorder, I was temporarily immune to the addiction feeling. I was easily successful in denying the opiates. That volume knob is now up to a 5, where the person feels that he or she has no choice in the behavior anymore. The subconscious generates intense pressure to seek that pleasure over and over again. The compulsory impulse comes sporadically and in episodes rather than constantly, but the intensity and duration of the episodes are extremely high and long. At this stage, it is no longer a choice. It has become an unseen force that seems larger and more powerful than the individual experiencing it. Denial and feeling that the choice to use is justified, appropriate, and necessary is now in place. The using compulsion is rationalized ad nauseum. A compulsion is often perceived as a choice, as it is accompanied by a myriad of rationalizations and justifications for participating in it. Yet there is no choice in the conventional sense of the word. There is a need that disguises itself as a choice. Therefore, it feels so similar to a choice that it is easily mistaken as one. Compulsion transcends choice. This is realized when we abstain from the behavior. A choice denied can be unpleasant and unpreferred, even intensely, but can be surpassed with moderate effort. But a compulsion denied is an intense feeling of need that is similar to a survival need. Denying a compulsion is accompanied by a subconsciously exerted punishment in the form of intense anxiety, depression, tension, and confusion. The subconscious mind is determined to enforce the behavior to the point of extreme distress by activating basic stages of fight or flight survival mechanism mentalities. A compulsion is typically misinterpreted as a conventional choice, but it is severely realized as a compulsion by disproportionate anguish when it is denied. The compulsion has become so large and powerful that acceptance has taken place. This is the major difference between the addict and the compulsive. The addict knows he or she is addicted and struggles both internally and externally with this knowledge. The addict may accept that he or she is an addict, but often does not feel it is worth treating, or that there would be no success in treating it. This is an advanced stage, often accompanied by a surrender of the will and spirit to the disorder, such as, oh well, I'm an addict, I do drugs, it's what I do. Acceptance of the addictive state is giving up and surrendering to it. A state of unity with the disorder is accompanied with a reluctance to accept another possible state as viable or optional. This unity feature is severe, a sense that there is no separation of one's own identity with the identity of being an addict. It is similar to how most of us feel about our own names. We may not love them, but we accept that this is the label we go by and therefore who we are. Addiction acceptance is a severe stage when we lose duality or separateness with our addiction, and a mental spirit of unity is forged with the pathology. At this stage, it is unlikely that we will attempt to surpass or work on the addiction without an event that triggers a shift in consciousness. It is like a sense of being okay with it in the way we accept the weather. We may not like the weather, we may even hate it, but we know it is beyond our control, so there's little benefit on dwelling on our preference about it. The acceptance stage of addiction is complete submission to it. A rock bottom experience is usually required to alter it. If this is you, then listen up. Do not accept it. Resist, endure, and have confidence that many, you included, can indeed persevere beyond it. Addiction acceptance cannot be considered as an option. There is never a guarantee that things can be better, but there is certainly assurance that things can be worse. It may not seem like things can ever be worse, but they certainly can be. This is the most severe form of addiction. It is a full-blown personality disorder functioning on the same levels of the mind and brain as other personality disorders like bipolar and OCD. APD is independent of drugs or any specific behavior like gambling or shopping. Independent of the means, it exists with or without anything specific and can attach itself to nearly anything. For example, a lion's predatory nature is independent of the zebras or antelope it can kill. It is not merely a zebra or antelope predator. It is a predator by nature, and it will hunt, kill, and eat anything it can if it is hungry. Being predatory is its nature, and it doesn't lose the will or drive to kill simply because nothing is immediately available or even if it's not hungry. Its predatoriness is awakened the instant something easy to kill becomes accessible, even if it's not hungry. In the same way, an addictive personality can become addicted to anything that satisfies that addictive nature, which is the need to be fully immersed in an experience. After a specific source of addiction is removed, say heroin, the addictive personality will continue to seek out pleasures and eventually fixate on other behaviors to an unbalanced degree. They can move from drugs to relationships to sex to fitness or video games or a seemingly harmless hobby or sport. The addictive personality is an all or nothing type, apathetic towards some things but overly zealous with others. They lack impulse control and usually fail to recognize when they are going too far, shutting out some things and becoming overly involved with others. The addictive personality loses perspective and balance in their lives over and over again. Addictive personalities have excessive tendencies with many, most, or even all things they like and have unreasonably passive and indifferent tendencies toward things they do not like, often to neglect. They're either all in or all out. They possess little to no balance or in-between attitudes. In essence, they are not so much addicted to a thing or behavior as to the intense feeling of being entirely immersed in something, anything. Addiction and addictive personality disorder are lifelong, as no one is ever cured. An addict can be symptom-free their whole lives, but they never stop being an addict. This is vital information for addicts as well as those who live with them. You don't have to live in constant fear, as there is no certainty the addict will relapse and use all his or her life. However, like OCD and diabetes, addicts must be cautious all their lives if they are to live symptom-free lives. Diabetics have to eat right and check their blood sugar. OCD and bipolar folks must have treatment with or without medication, and addicts and their loved ones need to be sensitive to their addictive condition always. If they live by the specific rules of their respective pathologies, they can and will live healthily. Not a single person can know which type they are, recreational, moderate, compulsive, addictive, or addictive personality, until they are exposed to the DOC that draws them in. It is impossible to know ahead of time, as the addictive pathology remains dormant until awakened by using or by pubescent development, puberty. You cannot prevent an addictive mind from activating once a particular drug or behavior is introduced. In other words, you cannot know which one you are until you play with fire, and this is not something worth getting burned over to find out. Would you sign up for OCD or bipolar disorder voluntarily, or roll the dice to see if you get it or not, simply to satisfy a curiosity? Experimenting with drugs is the same as entering into a lottery for a life-threatening disorder. You never know if you're going to be the one with the right ticket, but someone sure is.